Well, greetings again to each of you, and welcome back to the Shakedown, a podcast about corrections, for corrections, and by corrections. This is not your first time listening to us. Welcome back. If this is the first time that you have ever logged on and listened to this, let me welcome you to this podcast. After you're done listening to this one, let me encourage you, go back and check out. We had some phenomenal topics, some phenomenal guests in season 1, and then moving into season 2. I want to make sure that we keep this up to date, keep it fresh, keep it relevant. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, anything that ideas for topics maybe in the future, you can reach us at shakedown@jailtraining.org. I'm glad to welcome you as we continue our talk on sharpening skills and making sure that we don't just settle in and become complacent. We don't just think, I've got it, I've arrived, I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to worry about learning, I don't need to worry about growing, I don't need to worry I don't need to worry about making sure that I'm constantly moving forward. I have arrived. Well, newsflash, you have not arrived. There's never going to be a point in which any of us can say, I've arrived. There's nothing else that I need to learn, no more I need to grow. There's no more attention I need to pay to my skills. Absolutely not. And so I hope that in these first 3 episodes that we've had in this series that you've been encouraged and informed, challenged. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Sean Stewart last week. As is often the case with Sean and I, anytime we get to talking about something, it's not going to be a 3-minute conversation. But I hope you enjoyed what he was able to present as his thoughts on skills for line officers to make sure that we keep sharp. And I was glad to be able to have him back this week to continue discussing some skills that in his mind are important to keep sharp for supervisors and administrators. Because as line officers, the inmates are our job. The job of corrections is our job. But as supervisors and administrators, our job becomes the staff. And so it's a different set of dynamics, different skills involved. You can have somebody that is extremely effective as a line officer, as a floor officer, knows how to do everything in your facility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good supervisor. So I'm intrigued to hear what Sean has to add this week as we talk about skills that are important to keep sharp for supervisors and administrators. So without further ado, let's jump into this interview. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as promised, we are back again this week with the one, the only Sean Stewart from Arizona. I hope you enjoyed our conversation last week. Still talking about sharpening skills, focusing on last week, the line officer, primarily that interaction with those inmates. And, again, if you were looking at a typical sharpening skills discussion, probably not some things that you would find listed in that inventory, but key and crucial components, as you said last week, Sean, of a long-term fulfilling career. Not just I'm here for a while, I'm going to hang out, and then I'm moving on to something else.
So let me put it like this. I'm not an academic. I'm a boo.
There you go.
I did the job. So I know what worked and I know what didn't work. And I'm not just talking theories. I mean, after a 30-year career, I can look back and I can see some things that I did wrong that didn't work, that maybe academia thought was a good idea, but it wasn't and it didn't work. And so the things I'm putting to you are the things that I put into play that actually worked. And I'm not discounting academia. A lot of times they have good ideas, and a lot of times what they put out does work. But if it doesn't, it doesn't.
Right. Yeah, and if that's all you've got is what they put out and it doesn't work, then what are you left with if you haven't got another resource to tap into and say, hey, wait a minute. All right. Like you said last week, if you don't know the answer to the question, there's somebody in your building that does, that has walked that has worked that. They may not have all these letters behind their name, signifying academic degrees, but they know how to run a housing unit. Go ask them how to do it, and you'll get an education without a doubt.
Find that good, like, talking about officers again, but find that good officer that comes to work every day, look sharp in their uniform, boots are shined, the inmates respect and listen to, and watch them and emulate them.
Yes.
You know, find somebody that's going to socialize you into that agency the right way.
Right.
Not the wrong way.
Yeah. So let's jump into this week. I know we talked about, obviously, primarily line officers and skills that they need to consider. They need to be aware of, that they need to continue to develop, stay sharpened. Let's roll into the supervision in our conversation this week, which, of course, obviously adds the added element of you're responsible for staff, and that the dynamics that come along with not just being a corrections officer responsible for inmates, but now you're a supervisor and you're responsible for you're responsible for staff as well. I remember when I got I got promoted to corporal. My first night working night shift, first shift coming in with new, brand spanking shiny stripes on my sleeve. And I come in, and the day shift sergeant we were relieving, he got up and he shook my hand. He congratulated me, and he told me, he said, "I'll give you one piece of advice." I said, "All right, what is it?" And he had a full head of white hair. And he said, "I'll give you this one piece of advice." He said, "You see this head of white hair?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The inmates didn't put it there." And I laugh then, and I laugh every time I think about it. But the dynamics of supervision, it adds so much more to it. And there's a whole separate skill set that you got to have to be an effective supervisor. I mean, you can be a phenomenal line officer. And you may know every detail of that facility. That doesn't mean you're going to be a good supervisor. And so let's talk about what are some things in your experience, and maybe personally, that you saw work out, or maybe something that you saw demonstrated by somebody else, that are some skills that supervisors need to be aware of and think about.
Well, let's talk about our organization. First of all, every organization is broken up into three sections, right? You have your employees,
right?
You have your supervisors, your first line supervisors, and then you have upper management,
right? And
all three have a core function. I like to tell people, one of the things I realized once I became upper management was I'm in all reality, I'm not, other than getting them what they need and toilet paper and stuff, I'm not really here for the inmates anymore. You become a servant. Everything, when I look back, everything I did as an upper management person was to support those line officers, get them what they need, give them quality policies and procedures, make sure my policies were legal based, and things along those lines. So in all reality, as an upper manager, you're more there for the officers than the inmates. Right. Now, you write quality policies and procedures. Sometimes you have to deal with inmate issues, but for the most part, your job is to supervise and manage the employees. Yeah. And give them the tools they need. So in knowing that, each level has, primary functions to perform. And if there's any inefficiency or incompetence in any one of those three levels, the organization fails on its face. Yes. So I like to say, so if you're an employee, what are your functions? Well, you're to follow, you're to achieve, you're to learn, you're to perform, you're to change when necessary, and seek help when you need it, and comply. That's basically what you need to do as an employee. Then let's say first line supervisor, corporal, or sergeant. What are you supposed to do for your organization? You're supposed to lead, motivate, train on a daily basis. One of the things that annoys me is when I always hear, "Oh, we don't have any training money. We can't." You can train every day, and it costs you nothing but time. Right. An email saying, "What's our use of force policy?" And you got 14 days to respond. Now, what are they going to do? They're going to go look it up. Hell, you can even give them the page number the policy's on. I don't care. Yeah. But they have to respond. They're going to go look it up. They're going to read it, and then they're going to copy and paste it in an email and send it back to you. And I say that because that's something I did at some point in time. And I was a lieutenant, and I had a sergeant come up to me and say that I was stupid because I don't, all they're going to do is go read it and reply. And I said, and I'm stupid. Maybe that's all I want you to do is read it.
That's right.
And reply. And then, he gets his, oh, so, train, and you can train, play the what if game on a daily. You walk in a pod and just play the what if game with an officer in your squad.
Yeah.
That is training, right?
Yes.
Document, counsel when you need to counsel. If you need to refer somebody for more training or help, refer them, and then discipline when necessary at your level.
Yeah.
Wherever I go around the country, I hear one thing everywhere I go, and that is the problem today is first line supervisors are too worried about being everybody's friend instead of supervising them. I hear that from the East Coast to the West Coast. I don't know if it's a societal thing. I don't know if we're promoting people. It took me, I was 28 when I started with my department. It took me 5 years to promote for sergeant.
Yeah.
So I was almost 30 years old when I promoted to sergeant, and I had 5 years of experience. And that was pretty quick in my organization. But if you look around today, we're promoting people that might have 2 years on. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. It's not a great thing, but we do what we have to do with the staff we have available.
Yes.
And, so if we know that in listening to the people, then maybe the lieutenants and the captains need to spend a little more time supervising those sergeants and those corporals and getting them up to speed and making sure that they're supervising their areas. Why? Because if you don't supervise, you're setting people up, and they're going to get in trouble sooner or later.
Yeah.
Because of failure to supervise. And the higher you go in your organization, let's say you promote to corporal and you have 5 people under you, you're responsible for those 5 people's actions while they're on duty.
Right.
Right. Especially if you're on scene.
Yes.
But if you don't enforce if you don't discipline or at least step in when you see bad practice, you can be held responsible for that as well, allowing a continuing bad practice to transpire in your facility. So upper commands, lieutenants and captains, what do? You create, you direct, you employ, we hire, we educate, we develop, and then we support our staff. And then you enforce and discipline at your level when you need to. I always had a philosophy. I don't discipline one rank below. And talk about change, we'll talk about in a little bit. That was one of those things I learned over time. If I was a captain and I'm walking out through the belly of the beast, so to speak, and I see somebody doing something and I deal with it. First of all, did I step on a sergeant, a corporal, or a lieutenant's toes when I did it? And did I do their job for them? So what I started to realize was, okay, I'm not going to, unless obviously if it's a safety and security issue, it needs to be dealt with right away. But if it's not, and it's these other ancillary things, what I started doing was I would see it, and then I would call the lieutenant into my office, and I would say, hey, this is what I saw. It needs to be corrected. And if you can't correct it, then I'll deal with you. Right. I'm not going to deal with the officer anymore. I'm not going to deal with, and then that lieutenant has to go deal with the sergeant, and the sergeant has to confront the individual. Now, I'm sure they went, Captain Stewart saw you and whatever, but they had to deal with it some way, somehow.
Right.
And I wasn't doing their job for them, nor was I stepping on their toes.
Yes.
Because I may call the lieutenant and say, well, and then he's going to tell me something I didn't know.
Sure.
Like, yeah, we've been dealing with it, but this officer's having issues at home, and this is what we've been doing. Okay, then keep working on it. So don't confront like one, as a senior commander, don't confront those line officers unless it's a safety and security issue. Force your lieutenants and your sergeants and your first line supervisors to do their jobs.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
And then, staff discipline. I think a lot of times we as supervisors give too much weight and focus on the outcome instead of the officer's thought process. And what do I mean by that? First of all, as supervisors, we must supervise.
Right.
That's why our title is supervisor. And unfortunately, when appropriate, we must discipline. Now, I'm not talking about running around your facility, killing a fly with a sledgehammer all the time. I mean, discipline can be you and me having a 5-minute conversation, and then I log it on an Excel spreadsheet. On this day, I talked to Aaron Dawson, and I told him his grooming standards weren't up to par, or whatever,
Right.
whatever it was, or he needed to make better quality rounds and spend a little more time. I talked to Sergeant Smith on this date because I noticed when he would go in the housing units, he signs off that he was there and then he immediately leaves and doesn't spend any quality time with that. So whatever, it doesn't mean you have to, formally, pound somebody, but you have to supervise.
Yes.
And when necessary, discipline to what extent that discipline is necessary.
Right.
And why do we do this? Again, like I said, told the officers, it ain't personal. I'm trying to correct your behavior in hopes that you will learn from your mistake or your misbehavior.
Yes.
Then not find yourself at some point down the road facing some serious consequences. I remember I would do audits. I had a sergeant that his job was quality control and audits. And he had 30 to 40 things that he would submit to me and my other captains every year saying, I'm going to audit this, I'm going to audit that, and we would approve it. And as the year went along, if something happened and I wanted something audited, then I could just cut him loose to go audit this situation. Sure. And I remember he was auditing rounds and quality of rounds, randomly pulling video and then pulling the round log sheet, comparing them. And there was one officer, he was spot on, but to me on video, it doesn't look like he's looking in the cells. He's doing drive-by rounds, just walking the perimeter and not really taking a good look into the cells. So that comes out on the audit. And once the audit was done, it would be turned in to the 3 captains, and the auditor would have to give us recommendations. And then we would document why. Because if we ever got hit with a failure to supervise, I could pull out all these audits and show, no, we're supervising constantly and we're auditing our staff's tasks. So on this one, this guy happened to be in my housing unit. So I called the guy downstairs and, again, you don't have to, kill a fly with a sledgehammer. So I just said, hey, dude, you've become complacent. You need to pull your head out and start paying attention and doing quality rounds. Yes, sir. I promise. All right. This is your verbal warning. You need to start doing rounds. And then I document on this is how I dealt with the problem in my area, and it gets filed away. 2 weeks later, he's on duty and he has a successful suicide. But I watched his rounds and he was spot on. And he stopped in front of every door, looked through the windows.
Yeah.
And the very next day, he wants to come in my office and see me. And he comes in and he's thanking me for saving his career.
Sure.
By having that conversation with him. So that's what I mean by if we don't supervise these people and correct complacency or bad behavior or bad practice, staff, he would have been terminated if we would have seen those rounds that I saw 2 weeks prior. The day of the suicide, that officer would have lost his job and his ability to support his family. And he knew that. And then also as senior commanders, and you're looking at a situation, and you're deciding whether somebody deserves discipline or what type of discipline. I always tell people, our policy and procedures Bibles are guidelines. And I know a lot of administrators don't like when I do this, but the fact is they're guidelines because we're dealing with human beings. You cannot put into policy every action that an officer may, even your use of force policy. It's like the inmate will dictate this use of force.
Yes.
They comply or they don't. They resist or they don't. They become combative, staff. So each scenario is different. And instead of looking at a policy as a black and white document, a Bible, remember it's guidelines.
Yes.
What I like to tell staff and officers who worked for me, whether they be lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, officers, is you don't get to violate policy by accident. But if you did violate it and you had a reason why you took an action contrary to policy,
right,
just know you did it and then articulate why you had to deviate. What were the circumstances?
Yes.
And then again, never violate policy and procedure by accident. If you had to deviate from policy, know you did it and articulate the reason and your thought process for doing it. And usually you'll be okay, especially if you think along the lines of safety and security, why you had to deviate.
Yes.
And then as supervisors, when this happens and you understand that these policies are gray and not black and white, and you're looking at what the officer did, let's say they're facing this situation. There could be 20 ways to solve or to decide to deal with this situation.
Right.
And you need to decide, did they just do it a different way than you would have? Or were they truly wrong? Right? Yes. So that's what I mean by thought process. I would call them in and say, what were you thinking? What was going on? What's the policy? And they would tell me, and then sometimes they convinced me that the way they decided to handle the situation was probably better than how I thought they should have handled the situation.
Right, yes.
Or at least I understand. So every policy violation isn't automatically a wrong decision. Yes. Maybe they just chose a different way to solve the problem. And if they're explaining their thought process to you and you're like, well, okay, I get it. Well, then maybe discipline's not necessary and we can have a conversation to where I can get you to realize your thought process was wrong and here's how you should handle it next time. Right. Doesn't mean I'm not going to document that we had this conversation, because what I tell people is when you get discipline, what's important is not the discipline. To me, it's that I don't see the discipline for the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
Right? Because all we want you to do is learn. When an officer does something really bad, and let's say it's in the news media, and you're sitting at home, like, we become really good at putting out fires. If you look at firemen, they go there, they put out the fire, and then the first thing they start doing is investigating how that fire started. We're really good at running there, putting out the fire, but we're not very good at trying to figure out how that fire started.
Right. Yes.
And this is something I learned over time. So you have to look, when something happens, you have to ask yourself as a commander, when the officer engaged in this bad behavior, how did we get here? First, there's only two ways we got here. Did you hire that officer that way? Or introspectively, did you create that officer? By not supervising them, by not holding them accountable to the point they got to that point. And I can give you a story on that. We had an officer who was bringing an inmate up to disciplinary segregation. Okay. There's already two officers working in that housing unit, but when he comes to the Sally Port, he walks up the stairs, puts the inmate in the cell, walks in the cell, and closes the door. Anybody who's been doing this job long enough knows exactly what's about to happen.
Uh-huh.
Well, it didn't work out. The inmate won. And I'm terminating the officer because he should not have done that, right? I mean, you should have got there, turned him over to the two housing unit officers, and went about your business. Unfortunately, right. something that transpired that this officer took personal. When you take things personal, you're usually probably going to lose your job, because then you do stupid things. When your emotions get involved, you do stupid things. And the kid was a decent kid. And again, I put out the fire. He was terminated. When the press came around, I got to say, hey, he deviated from our policies and procedures. He did not have the moral compass that we require of our officers, so he no longer works here. And then about a week after that, I'm walking into the sergeant's office, and I'm a captain. I walk into the sergeant's office, and a sergeant, believe it or not, looks at me and goes, "It's about time you guys figured that out." And I went, "Figured what out?" And he said that officer so and so was heavy-handed and had a hothead. He was a hothead. And I look at that sergeant. I remember thinking, you should probably think about what you're telling me right now, because
Right.
what I'm hearing is you're not a very good supervisor, because this kid was a good kid. So you were aware that he was heavy-handed and he was hot-headed, and
Right.
obviously you did nothing about it. You waited for it to get to a level that it got my attention to
Yes.
deal with. Well, unfortunately, by the time it gets to my level and causes the all-seeing eye to look at it, it's probably going to be detrimental to the employee. And from that day forward, I really had no respect for that sergeant, because,
Mm.
like I said, that sergeant allowed this person to get to that point, and now this kid doesn't work there anymore. He'll never get a job in law enforcement again, and I blame the sergeant
Right.
at that point. So, I lost all respect for that sergeant. He could have intervened way before this situation got there. And if it required a letter of counseling or something else to try and rectify this bad
Sure.
practice that this officer had, I believe, knowing the kid to the point that I knew him, had somebody confronted him on that, he would have changed his ways.
Sure.
But nobody confronted him, so it continued. Um, the other thing I see with a lot of leaders is, they become stuck in a style. And
Mm.
what I've realized over time is you have to be able to change your leadership style based on the people you're leading. I
Right.
hear everybody complain about millennials and everything like that. Well, complain all you want, they're not going away.
Yes. Right.
We have to deal with them. Um, and obviously, we all know with a millennial, you can't treat them like you could treat us. Just tell us what to do, and we're going to go do it. They want to know why they have to do things. They want to know what the reasoning is behind certain things. Um, they when I was working as an officer, I did not want to see a senior commander walk into my housing unit. If I saw one, I was worried I did something wrong. I
Right.
just didn't want to see him. You sent me to training. You gave me the OJT, and I completed the CTO program. And you told me I could run my pod autonomously within policies, procedures, and the law, but it was my pod. So I didn't want to see supervisors. So I remember when I first promoted, I thought the same thing. And then you start hearing, well, we never see you. How come we don't see you? I'm like, really? You want to see? So I had to adjust and make sure that I put on my calendar, on this day I'm going to spend all my time back in my housing units, and I'm going to visit my staff, and
Yeah.
and I'm going to converse with them, because basically, that's what this generation wants. They want their supervisor to see them. They need to be told more often that they're doing a good job
Right.
than you and I needed to be told. And it's not, I'm not knocking on them. It's just that's how they're raised. That's their psyche. So
Yes.
as a leader, obviously, what's the most important resource we have in our facility? It's our
Oh,
staff.
absolutely.
And it's a resource that everybody's fighting for. So you want to take care of your staff so they don't want to leave. Um, Most staff don't leave for money. The grass is greener on the other side. Not really. Uh, Usually when they leave, they'll say it's money, but a lot of times it's because of supervision. Um,
Right.
their perception of unfairness, but it's not really the money, because usually the money that they're going for is chump change.
Right.
If it's within, state to, if it's, from county to county within a state, the pay isn't that much greater somewhere else, and you're going to give up whatever tenure you have, whatever seniority you have to go get 50 cents an hour more. No, that's your excuse. You're leaving because you're upset, usually with something. And I'm not saying that they're always right. Sometimes
Right.
they're upset because they didn't make sergeant. Well, you didn't test good enough to make sergeant.
Right.
And have the a lot of times after a testing process, people get upset. I always like to say, have a debrief after the testing process. Call everybody who tested in.
Yes.
Explain to them where they went wrong, what questions they missed. Because if you're doing a good testing process, you're going to change it up next time you test anyway.
Right.
A little bit off subject, but back to the officer. You're testing for sergeant. You go into an oral board. Remember what position you're putting in for. Stop answering the questions like a line officer. You are testing for, so that's some of the advice I would give them. Is you answered all the questions like an officer. Well, I'm not promoting an officer, I'm promoting a sergeant.
Yes.
Next time you come into the oral board, remember what position you're putting in for and answer those questions based on that position.
Yes.
Not what you're doing today. And the other thing I used to like to tell them is, and don't come into an oral board and, for lack of a better term, blow smoke up my ass. Every day I see you. Every day I know what you do. And man, I really wish you were that officer that you were talking about in the oral board on a daily basis.
Right.
Every day is an oral board. The other thing with supervisors is when you've made a decision and it's not working, just admit that it's not working and reverse course. What used to drive me crazy as an officer and as a first line supervisor is when a senior commander would come out with this edict and it just wasn't working.
Sure.
And instead of admitting that it wasn't working and, tweaking it or just saying, hey, we got to try something else, by God, it's going to work. And they just dig in deeper and deeper and deeper, and it just keeps failing. If you had an idea or you made a decision and it is not working, you're not getting the results that you intended to get, turn the ship around. Just admit that it's not working. Turn the ship around. Everybody knows it's not working. Everybody knows that you as a senior commander in your organization are the one who's continuing down that course and taking them with you. So listen to your staff, pay attention, make your rounds. When an officer does something good, give him an attaboy. And I don't mean give him this plaque or something. Shoot him an email saying, hey, I was reading the daily briefing. You did a great job in intake with that combative inmate.
Yeah.
Bravo Zulu, buddy. Keep it up.
Yeah.
You're walking down. I used to pay attention to the briefing summary and I'd take notes and I would write down which officers I needed to say did a good job. I'd go up into the housing unit and say, hey, man, I saw what you did last week, man. Good job on finding that contraband or doing this. If you give, and that means a lot to them. They'll play it off, but in the back of their minds, they're like, man, that's pretty cool. And when they're deserving of a plaque or something, by all means, do that. But you don't want to overkill that aspect of attaboys because they become routine and they don't have the importance that they have. I used to keep challenge points. I went out and bought like 100 of my own, and I had intake and ID at the time. And whenever somebody did something really good, I would just go in and toss them a challenge coin and say, hey, man, good job. You got the challenge coin. They were all trying to earn a challenge coin. That it became a thing. And then I found out later on that each shift was trying to see which shift could be the first shift for every officer to get a challenge coin.
That's awesome.
Little things like that. And again, your officers are your most valuable resource. So common sense tells you that if your supervisory style isn't working, maybe it's time to retire. if you can't change,
Right.
or you need to change up and look at other ways to supervise these people.
Yeah.
So that's all I got to say on that issue.
Well, that is awesome. Well, Sean, I appreciate that. And I'll tell you in all the research and the training that I'm doing recently, it has all been about basically what you just said, in that, you know, you can pull a book about leadership principles, let's say 30, 40, 50 years ago, and there's some great stuff in there to glean and pull out, no question. But when you talk about that interaction with the individual, there's nothing better than, I'm doing this. How are they responding to it? If we're not getting the response we need, I need to back up and readjust, and let's do this again. Because as an administrator, as a supervisor, truthfully, my success is tied up in their success. If you know, if
and you just sparked a thought. You have to practice what you preach.
yes,
You have to set the example. I'll take something, um, something I heard recently, which was, as a leader, you have to lead yourself, right? Lead always and lead others.
yeah,
Lead always and lead yourself, for lack of a better term, is if you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk.
that's right.
Yes. I did 30 years and never called in sick once. Um, my family wasn't happy with it, but I couldn't call in sick because, first of all, I wasn't. Secondly,
Right.
if I don't show up, somebody's going to have to do my job for me, and
Right.
it just wasn't in my personality to do that. So when I would tell an officer, you can't, if you're sick, then call in sick, because I don't want you to come in here and get everybody else. But if you're just having a bad eye day and you just can't see coming to work,
Yeah.
get in here, because somebody, and I've always had, staff were always telling me, hey man, when you told us that, we had nothing to say, because we know you never call in sick. You're
Yeah.
always here. I would come in on off days. I would show up on holidays. First of all, I'd show up on major holidays like Christmas, Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Uh, and I would just walk my unit, and I would thank my officers for coming into work that day. Hey, you
Yeah.
know what? Thank you. I know it was difficult for you to get up, leave your family, and come here on Christmas Day,
Yeah.
but I noticed it, and I see
Yes.
you. I appreciate it. The county appreciates it. The sheriff appreciates it. And
Yeah.
and you know, little things like that go a long, long way.
Yes.
Um, just acknowledging the fact that it's a hardship that you're here today, and I understand it. Oh, and by the way, I'm here, and I didn't go to briefing and catch the whole squad. I went in to each and every one of my housing units that were assigned to me in my building and spent 5 minutes thanking them. Now, I'll tell you, the good idea is do that during day shift on Thanksgiving. So when you get off, you go home, all the fights are over the food's on the table. Anyway, but simple things like that just go a long way in keeping these officers, and they know you're watching. So when they have this inkling to do something stupid, maybe they're
Right.
going to say no, because you know what, Stewart's going to know, and I'm
Yeah.
just not going to do this.
Yeah.
So it's they're time consuming things sometimes, but they're simple things to do.
Yes.
They're not difficult, and you can read all the leadership books in the world. And I read a lot, and they're hard to find for our profession, because you can get the military leadership, but we're kind of stuck in the middle. I
Yeah.
can't do what some general in the military can do,
Right.
because if you don't behave there, they can put you in the brig, they can work you 24. So, and then I can't do what the private world does either,
Right.
because I still have to report to my taxpayers, right? I mean, I can't create a relax room in the jail where they can go play video games on their breaks and lay on the
Right.
couch. It just wouldn't fly. But you can you can read this business leadership model and this military leadership model, and take 4 or 5 components from this one and 2 or 3 components from that one, meld them and make them your own, and create your own leadership style based on these other concepts. and then constantly look to improve yourself as a leader and change when you have to change based on the dichotomy of your staff, because you're having an influx of who knows what the next generation is going to bring.
That's
And I'm
right.
tired. So again, you have to be able to change your styles when you're looking at the people you're trying to lead, and you have to look at your staff as individuals as well, and not a squad. Everybody has individual problems,
Yeah.
everybody has individual issues that they're dealing with, and a cookie cutter approach when you're dealing with an individual isn't going to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just, and get to know your people. I've made it a habit of trying to know my people. Obviously, as a captain, it got more difficult as I had 200 or 300 corrections officers assigned to me. But as a sergeant, a lieutenant, I would try to know them. I know their wives' names, their kids' names, if their kids were in sports, so I could ask them, "Hey, how'd your kid do in the baseball tournament yesterday?" "Oh, he did great," because they know you care,
Yeah.
or at least you give the perception that you care if you're not a caring person.
Yeah.
It goes a
Awesome.
long way.
Awesome. Well, guys, we are about out of time for this, Sean. I greatly appreciate your time with us today, guys. Definitely food for thought, something to stew on and to apply as you get the opportunity to. But guys, as always, until the next time, stay sharp, stay safe, stay vigilant. Godspeed to each of you.